But the way this is going to work in a few moments is I'll do a very quick intro. But before we get to that, I do want to highlight for those of you who haven't done a Zoom with WakeLP before, a few of the kind of ground rules. I do ask that your questions be questions. I know we have some people that sometimes like to pontificate and get on their soapbox. Please be very courteous with our guest and make sure you're asking a question, because Heather is who we want to hear from this evening. Please stay on topic. Again, topic is education. It's Wake County. A lot of the stuff at the state level does impact Wake County, but please try to stay on topic around Wake County Public Schools. Please be polite. If you're not familiar with the raise your hand feature in Zoom, please look at that. It should be easily accessible down there to raise your hand. If not, just go to the chat and just say, I have a question. The way I've done this in the past that kind of works is I try to make sure that everybody at least gets one question in before I circle back and let people get their second, third, and fourth question in. So if you would keep that in mind, again, that's meant to prevent 30 people from unmuting themselves and all asking a question at once, because that doesn't work well, as you know. With that in mind, does anyone have questions about how we intend to run this? Because basically we're gonna, after the intro, open this up to Heather, who has joined us this evening, and let her speak on a variety of issues and topics that are certainly top of mind in the area right now. I mean, public schools and education is probably the top issue for a lot of voters and parents and people here in the community, teachers, and really excited to have Heather here to speak about these things. Any questions about what we have going on this evening from anyone? Fantastic. So with that in mind, real quick, our guest speaker this evening is Heather Scott. She's on the Wake County Board of Education for District 1. If you're not familiar with District 1, it's basically Northeast Wake County. So you're talking about Wendell, Roseville, Wake Forest, parts of Knightdale, I think some parts of Northeast Raleigh. For this group, particularly libertarians, Heather is an interesting background. She's taught in, as I understand it, charter schools, private schools, and public schools. So a fairly diverse background there. She herself has 2 children. She's been in Wake County since 2008, and I couldn't quite tell. You're a Hoosier, I believe, by birth. All right, we'll allow that. And I had someone coach at Bloomington for a while that I know is a good friend. And also of interest to libertarians, Heather won her seat in 2018. I don't want to say upset, but it was certainly a very grassroots campaign, and it wasn't one where money won out. So always encouraging for people in this group who like to see sometimes the underdog win. With that in mind, I will mute myself and turn the floor over to Heather to create or correct whatever I perhaps missed there in that intro. Again, thank you for joining us, Heather.
Thanks, David. And that pretty much summarizes who who I am. I am a Hoosier. I actually went to Indiana University, and I am a music teacher. So I had my first teaching job in 1998. Taught in public schools in Indiana, and a traditional public school system in Indiana, and also in San Diego. And then taught in a private school in Northwest Indiana, a parochial school, and then also taught at a charter school in Raleigh that's now in Wake Forest. So I do have a lot of different teaching experience. So I guess just to sort of start off, I appreciate you highlighting the 2018 campaign. I am the parent of 2 kids. My kids are in elementary school in 3rd and 5th grade. And one of my kiddos does have an IEP. If you're not familiar with that, that's an individualized education plan. And those are provided for students who need some sort of supports outside of the traditional public, the curriculum that's available. And so for my child's needs the whole process of getting an IEP as well, going through the process of applying for one, it can be pretty daunting. There's a lot of, deck 1, 3, 5, all these different plans and all these different things. And even as an educator, someone who sat in from the teacher standpoint, sat through many IEP meetings for students, off and on over the 12 years or 11 years that I taught full time in the classroom, it was still quite a process. And in the meantime, your own child is struggling, or you wouldn't be going through that. I mean, there's some things that need support, and I just we believe in the public school system. We believe in the purpose. We believe that every child should have a great education and have access to a strong education. I think public education is probably one of the most important public goods because it's truly an investment in people. And so very much believed in that. And in 2018, I was following Kerr and Huey on Twitter and saw that no one had filed for District 1. And this is kind of a trend. I'm not sure how many people are aware, but throughout North Carolina, throughout the country, there are often vacant school board seats, or only one person applies, no one person files, or nobody challenges the incumbent, for years and years and years. And there was no one filing for District 1. It looked like the previous person was not going to file again. And it was heartbreaking to me. And I talked to my husband, these schools, and particularly Eastern Wake, have often felt neglected, and no one's standing up to want to represent them. And so we had a long talk, and so we went down to the board of elections, and turned out that same day, a few hours before, after I had already entered in my paperwork, I found out that Don Mile had filed. And then 2 days later, we had Jim Thompson filed as well. So the race ended up being 3 people, and it just put one foot in front of the other, and somehow came out on top. So I share all of that to say, sometimes politics, it looks like you have connections to people, you have to have a lot of money. A school board race in a midterm election, or an off-term, an off year, or any seat, just put yourself out there. You believe in things that you're passionate about, so you definitely need to just move forward with that. So that's just a little bit of background, and then of course, 2020 election. Ran for re-election. There was only one other person who filed, and that race nearly killed me because it was pretty intense running in a presidential year with so many passions. But I'm really honored to serve again. This year, of course, has just been brutal on everyone, and my email inbox has been probably one of the most grueling things. Not to receive the volume of email, but because of the very real impact that COVID has had on everybody, on our children, our teachers, families, the economy, and it's really hard. It's been really heartbreaking and hard. I think as a school board, we've really tried to do the best that we can. Certainly not perfect. Certainly, lessons learned in many ways, but we do keep moving forward. We are here to serve our students. So that is just a little bit. I don't know, David, or I know Brad and I spoke a little bit about some of the topics, but I feel like, I don't know if you think perhaps sort of a Q&A might be more appropriate, or if there's any sort of topics that you want me to sort of expand on?
I think we should probably start. I mean, the one that always constantly comes up is maybe if you could talk about kind of the in-person, like as Wake's transition, the state's transition to in-person instruction. If you could talk about that, and then I think we'll transition to a Q&A format if you're comfortable with that.
Sure, absolutely. I appreciate that. So this is it's confusing, I think, for most people. It's confusing as a board member, but I think it's confusing for most people to even understand what options were available to the state of North Carolina. So over the summer, a sort of collaborative effort at the state level from the folks at the Department of Public Instruction, the State Board of Education, and Department of Health and Human Services sort of worked collaboratively to compose reopening plans, sort of reopening scenarios, plans, ideas, but then also following strict guidance that was matching health, the health recommendations and guidance and strategies for mitigating the spread of COVID. And those changed. I mean, those documents changed. I had paid to get the Lighting Our Way Forward, this big booklet from DPI, and then it changed. And the toolkit was actually Department of Health and Human Services. I was just reading before logging in, have changed again their recommendations for school operating. So there are these documents, these living documents that truly continue to sort of change and morph right when they were issued, and that was in June. And so all public school systems and all public schools, including charter schools, needed to follow these strategies. And then Governor Cooper, so we had plans A, B, and C. Plan A is what Governor Cooper had decided was okay for grades K through 5. And that is minimal social distancing, when possible, when it's feasible, have social distancing, masks are worn. But that's basically it. And then there is the plan B, which all grades 6 through 12 are required to be in. And that's a hybrid model for most schools, depending on their capacity and their student population. That does require students to be spaced 6 feet apart. That does require just a reduced capacity in classrooms, cafeterias, and common spaces. So they had suggestions within the Lighting Our Way Forward. Your plan B might look like this, and it had different suggestions and ideas. So, again, based on the number of students in buildings, the Wake County Public School System did the cohort model. So where we have families who have chosen to be in person, they have the cohort. So the students are in 1 week, and then they are remote for 2 weeks. And so we have this rotating in and out of the classrooms. Other school districts have done the same thing with the rotations, but they might do 2 days, 1 day off, 2 days. So that sort of changes. So that's, again, what Governor Cooper allowed. So these are and then Plan C is remote only. So those are the options that we had to work with. So looking at Wake County's plan and how we specifically implemented that, we started slowly. We worked really, we really listened to the ABC Science Collaborative and what they were saying early on before their study. And a lot of that was, to do this slowly. Don't bring everybody back at once. Do it slowly. Give people the opportunity to practice it. So when we adopted our plans and what those would look like for A, B, and C, that actually took place in the summer. And then those have been tweaked slightly in how we've implemented them. But for the most part, the plans have actually stayed the same. But we have tweaked a little where grades 4 and 5 right now are in a rotating cohort. So the grades 4 and 5 are in that Plan B, and grades 6 through 12 are also in Plan B. And then we do have the virtual academy options. So students who, for whatever reason, health reason, there are families who've chosen virtual academy because they just want to help. They can have their kids at home. They want to reduce the number of students in the building. So that's an option as well for students. And so our school populations, in-person population, or people who have chosen in-person, that varies anywhere from about 50% of the school is virtual versus the plans And then there's an elementary school where about 80% of their population, or even more than that, chose plans. So that sort of varies from school to school. So I hope that sort of provides like a general overview. I know it's so confusing because sometimes I'll receive emails from people who say, well, I chose plan B for my student. And I try to explain, well, you chose in-person learning with the understanding that, that could move in and out of those plans.
Okay. Appreciate that. So I think, Dee, do you still have a question, or?
I have a question. So I have 3 kids who went through the school system, and I actually taught them all how to read. And I noticed that the way that the school system was teaching them how to read was ineffective. And I actually got them outside help, and I taught them myself. By the time I got to the 3rd one, I just taught her myself and skipped the entire school process. And I found that when we sent our daughters to one of these really great blue ribbon schools, that's what all the parents were doing. And they were using a more structured phonetics-based approach, and it's very effective. And what I found is the school we sent her to actually has lower per student funding. That if you look at a school like Bug Elementary, it has very high student funding, almost $14,000 per student, but very horrible test grades, the worst test grades in the county. And what I'm wondering is if there has been anyone looking into how they're teaching the reading is ineffective. Because what I found in Morrisville, which had fantastic grades, everybody at Morrisville is succeeding, but the school is leveraging the parents. And I'm wondering if there's a big problem that schools like Bug are not leveraging the parents or leaving it up to the school system, and the holistic learning style as opposed to a phonetics approach. I know it didn't work for my kids, and I'm wondering if anybody's looked into if that's the cause of why we're having so many failures at a school like Bug, where they are getting $14,000 per student. That's my question.
So the reading curriculum, absolutely, especially for our younger grades, there have been some changes to that in recent years, where they are also using Letterland, which is that phonetic space. So we hear a lot about the science of reading, and that has changed. And that is something that actually I also am the chair for the Student Achievement Committee on the board. And the reports that we have on reading, I'll be happy to send some links later to some of those presentations that have taken place over the last few years. But that is something that absolutely very aware of. And also, noting that particularly our Black and Brown children, when you look at disaggregated test scores, that is something that is problematic, nearly everywhere, but particularly in the Wake County Public School System, and some schools more than others. Bug Elementary is a Title I school, so if you look at it per pupil funding, they do receive more funding because of the number of students who are experiencing poverty, and particularly the concentration of students experiencing poverty. So we could have a whole other meeting about ways to support our families, but it's also, when we're looking at standardized test scores versus something like reading, where you can sort of assess how students are progressing, either based on like a portfolio, just more of content mastery versus a standardized test. The data is pretty clear that standardized test scores they often reflect the number of students experiencing poverty at that school. So what we do try to do is make sure that we're looking at each individual child and looking to see if these changes to curriculum with implementing more of that letterland, that phonetics-based learning will be more effective. So early signs to some of the changes in the curriculum, we're looking pretty positive.
All right, thank you. The next question is from Ken. So wanted to know, in her opinion, why our county government administered public schools. Oh, Ken, did you want to ask that? Go ahead. Just.
I'd be happy to. Yeah. So thanks. First of all, thank you, Ms. Scott, for coming and sharing your perspective with us. It's always very helpful to hear from a number of different perspectives, especially folks who are in those seats making decisions. You mentioned when you were thinking about running for office that you had a real passion for the public school system. So I guess my question is, if a parent has a choice, in your opinion, why are the county government administered public schools better than, say, a charter school or private school or even homeschooling?
Well, I don't think I've said that they're better, but being passionate about the public education system is just sort of, especially here in Wake County, is sort of based on the history of the Wake County public education system. There's several videos. In fact, the Wake County public school system has a YouTube channel, and if you sort of look around and search through there, they do have I think it's like a 15-minute long video that talks about the history of the Wake County public school system. So I'm sorry if that was a little confusing in there, but having taught at different schools, I certainly recognize that there, for whatever reason, some school might be a better fit for a child. But I don't want to make like a sweeping statement that that they're better. I really believe in our public school system. That's why it was important for me to do what I could to support them.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. The next question I have is from Travis. Travis, unmute yourself, please. Travis, unmute yourself, please. Let me see if I can help do that. Travis, you need to unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. Thank you for joining us, Heather. I just had a quick question about the whole idea that the voucher systems are siphoning money away from the public school system. As libertarians, we're pretty strong advocates of school choice, and we believe that parents should make the ultimate decision, and that parents have the most say and they should have the most power in the children's lives. But there is a movement that is saying that the voucher system is siphoning money away from the public school, and I wanted to get your opinion on that.
I mean, my personal opinion on that is, I mean, it's a real thing. We're talking about there's finite funding available for education. And so anytime you're taking money that's earmarked for education, however that may be, and having that, go only to some schools versus others, it's going to have an impact. So, in my personal opinion, I mean, it does impact. I believe my role as a Board of Education member, as an elected official, is to make sure that we're being good stewards of tax dollars. That's absolutely important. But we also have a job to provide a quality education to all of our students. When we look at big picture things, when we look at barriers, understanding that any individual may say that barrier is not as impactful as it is. We're going to agree and disagree on that. But some of that, it is challenging. It just, that we're looking at finite funding. And when we have an obligation, a legal obligation, to make sure that the educational needs for every child living in Wake County are met, and we are also held accountable by certain standards, but some schools aren't held accountable. Some schools aren't as transparent with their budgets, and we have to show where every single dime goes. although I acknowledge it's a little challenging to sort of go through the Wake County Board of Education's budget, but you know, it's definitely part of, it has an impact. I can't say that it doesn't. You know, arguing right, wrong, or indifferent is sort of a separate conversation. But if the question is, does it have an impact? I mean, it does.
I know that makes sense. And if a certain school isn't doing what is necessary for the child, shouldn't the money follow the child and the parents have the decision where their own tax money goes, since it's our money anyway?
Well, and that is where, as libertarians, Republicans, Democrats, independents, and so forth, we certainly all have different opinions on, you know, just how far does that government reach go, right? So we all understand that. You know, somebody who's really passionate about, I'm not going to, you know, just insert tax funded thing here. But this tax funded thing here doesn't impact them as much, or they don't think it's important. You know, we could go around in circles about that. I will say though, that I think the problem with deciding whether or not a school is performing right now, it's hard because there are some charter schools that are geared towards, they're targeted towards lower income families. They're targeted towards students with special needs. Well, as I was saying before, those students tend not to test well. So if they have lower test scores, then those schools are at risk of being shut down. And it's a shame that I believe there was a charter school in Durham that lost their charter, that lost their school. And it was really heartbreaking to those families because it was the first place those families felt their child had a place. It was, you know, mostly special needs and kiddos who learned differently, but their test scores didn't look good. And I think maybe there were some budget things too. But you know, that's the other side of, if we put so much emphasis on test scores being the only way that we're defining whether or not a school is successful, and then you take that away from these families, you know, that's certainly not having a positive impact on any child to have to go through, you know, that sort of inconsistent experience.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Our next question will be from Steve. Steve, go ahead and unmute yourself and please ask your question.
Hi, Heather. Thanks for doing this tonight. Just curious if you know the dollar figures. What is the average cost per student in Wake County for, say, a regular student who goes to a regular public school versus the cost of a charter student, or private schools? I know you're not involved with the private schools, but is there a dollar difference, and how much of a dollar difference is that? And why would, if there is a difference, why is there a difference?
Are you talking about per pupil funding?
Yeah, per pupil.
And there is, and I should absolutely already have that memorized, and I'm sorry that I don't. But there absolutely is, and so you're looking at the types of funding that are going into the school, and so sometimes, you know, if there's someone who just asked a question, I'm so sorry, I forgot her name, but was talking about the per pupil funding at one of our Title I schools. So there is. And that really, you know, that just depends on the types of funding that are going into the school, what types of grants. I mean, the funding sources sort of go on for that. So it depends on what that's factored in different ways. But for what they receive from like federal funding versus state funding, for public schools versus private schools. So I know that there is like an average, and I don't have that, and I'm so sorry, I don't have that. It's something I should have memorized, but it absolutely does vary. And yes, when people look at students who are in the Wake County public school system in particular, that per pupil funding is going to look higher than a charter, and probably a private school as well. And some, factors that going into that are also the number of students that are experiencing substantial need. With special education, that's also funding, IDEA funding, Title I funding for students experiencing poverty. So that's something to keep in consideration as well.
Okay, thank you. The rotation I have is Brian Irving will be next with one of his 2 questions, and then I'll go to Brad and perhaps myself or Dee. Again, I'm trying to get everybody to have 1 question. So if you have a single question, or please raise your hand, let me know. Brian, go ahead and unmute yourself, please, and ask your question.
Yes, Heather, appreciate you being here this evening. And I appreciate the fact that, because many people involved in education think the libertarians are the enemy, and I appreciate you wanting to talk to us. Speaking of that enemy idea, do you see any way where the public school system and charter schools, which are actually public schools, and private schools can work better, more effectively and efficiently to improve the overall education system? I mean, I tell people that, I'm a libertarian. I'm not opposed to public school. I'm a product of public schools. I think the way to make them better is through competition and also through cooperation. And so I'm just looking at ways of building bridges. And instead of making charges about, charter schools and private schools taking money away from the public school system, finding ways to work together to improve the overall education system.
Brian, you have no idea how much I appreciate that question. And that is, that is my blue sky. That is my big picture dream. I would love nothing more than to figure out what is our collective role, whoever that is, what is our collective role, our collaborative role in providing a solid education for each and every child. And you're right. Unfortunately, people do get, it quickly becomes politicized, and people do get offended sometimes when, certain types of language are used, certain types of language is used rather. Whatever that may be, if someone's saying voucher schools are stealing from, public, this, and then someone says that's not fair, or someone says, well, this private school doesn't serve all children, and they say that's not true, so we could just, again, we could go around in circles. I do think that there needs to be a big picture. I don't have the answer for that, but I think when we're looking at schools that are publicly funded, like charter schools and traditional public school systems, how can we work together? I mean, I think most people know that North Carolina charter schools started out as sort of laboratory schools that were going to use innovative ideas and sort of report back to the public school system on how those ideas worked or didn't, provide opportunities for special education students. So the idea and charter, and this had to be listed in their charter application, so that this was all supposed to be working together. And then over the years, it's turned into something where it is a competition. But I do think that who is part of that conversation? Is it school leaders, elected officials, municipal leaders? How do we come together to work for that? But I think we started by having conversations like this. And I absolutely believe in keeping the lines of communication open, because I know I'm passionate about students and children having access to great teachers, having access to an education. But I talk about like my why that started, but my first year as a teacher in Southern Indiana, there was a little boy in a classroom who never raised his hand. He never participated in my general music class. It was a class he had to take as a 7th grade student. And then I did some digging and found out that no one in his family had ever graduated from high school. And since he showed up for school and he was your textbook passive resistant child, he didn't cause any problems, but he just didn't do any work, and he just kept, they're like, well, that's okay, let's just, you know, move him along. And that was heartbreaking to me. And I realized that that's just one barrier that's in front of a child, and how many of those barriers exist for so many of our kids. And it's our job as adults to break them down and to get those out of the way so they can have access to what they deserve. And so from that story, I mean, I worked with this student again and again and again until one day he raised his hand in my class to answer a question. And I think that was probably the first time in his 12 years that he had probably ever done that in a class. So when adults take that time to care, we can provide for our kiddos.
Thank you for that. Appreciate it.
All right, Brad, you are next with your question, please. Unmute yourself, please.
So I think I have a kind of a variation on what Brian's question was. Let me give you a little bit of background so you can appreciate where I'm coming from. My personal experience, I went to public school in New York, Westchester County, up to 10th grade, and my mother wasn't happy with how, not necessarily with the school, but how well I was performing. I ended up being exiled to a prep school in New Hampshire for the last year and a half. I graduated in January of my senior year. And I have to say, I didn't really enjoy that experience very much, but it was amazing in terms of education. I really learned more probably in that year and a half than I did in my next 4 years in college, and possibly in the whole entire time I had in school before. It was pretty eye-opening. When we moved to North Carolina, we really wanted to try the public school system because of the diversity and such. And we picked very carefully where we moved to a place where the school was well regarded. And we enrolled two of their three kids were school age. So we enrolled them there. And the older one, who I think was in 4th grade, was advanced placement or whatever the term is. And we were very unsatisfied with what we were getting, and they would take her out of school or out of class like 2 sessions a week, and so there was a social stigma attached to it, and it really wasn't adequate, and she was bored, and we were looking seriously at private schools. And then we discovered the magnet system, and ended up transferring her to Hunter, and we had the Hunter, Ligon, Enloe sequence of schools, and we were very, very happy with that. It worked out great. Child number 2 had an IEP, also the learning disability. They let her have a computer in school in the early 90s, when, before they had computers. She was allowed to bring a laptop in. It worked out well for all of them. None of them are, at home sponging off us. So we're pretty happy, users of the public school system, but it was a function of having choice. And I think, if you look at what Brian is driving at, one of the things that we believe from a libertarian perspective is that if you afford folks choices, you'll get better results. I mean, for example, you talked about the school in Durham where the parents were very happy, but because of low scores or whatever, they had issues. If there were a voucher system and those parents were able, in effect, to vote and support their school with their money, maybe that problem would have solved itself. Even though they had low scores, they were still doing a good job, relatively speaking, for those kids. Enough parents would have supported it, so the school would have been able to persist. So my basic question is, if we had a system where parents had choices, would that not enable schools or provide an incentive for schools to do better in terms of satisfying the students that they're serving and the parents that they're serving? And in effect, if you have an incentive system in place, then schools get rewarded for doing well, and schools get kind of some negative feedback if they're not doing well, and have an opportunity to improve. Is that a mechanism that you could see working with your vision of combining cooperation between all the different schools in Wake County?
I appreciate all of that, and I'm glad to hear that you did find a good fit for your kiddos, and that is one of the things that the Wake County Public School System does in itself. I think it's very confusing to people when they first move here and they what is a year-round school? What is a modified school? What is a traditional school? What is a magnet school? What is an early college school? What is a leadership academy? So they have, there is a lot of choice within the Wake County public school system, acknowledging that, families do want choice. And while there are some students who the magnet program is great for them to have the different electives and the different choices and to have a lot of transition within their school day, there are also children who do quite well at their base schools. And that also allows families the opportunity to be more involved. Base schools are typically going to be closer to where they live. And it just really depends on your learning style, as you noted. Every child does learn differently. Vouchers are certainly a complicated matter. Would a school independently be able to be completely funded on per pupil average? I would have to say probably not. So I don't know that a school like that would be able to function when you think about the costs that are involved, the operational costs that are involved with operating schools, when you're looking at everything from personnel, capital, et cetera. It's really expensive to do that, even without a complex student population. So I think that there is a lot of choice within the Wake County system, but also trying to balance that choice with operating our schools efficiently. So it's I think they like to use the term, it's not mine, but choice with a purpose. So choice that is enabling some independence and options for families, but we still have to be good stewards of tax dollars as well. And if the choice starts to impact a school to where it's not operating efficiently, then that's problematic. And we have to look at ways to solve that. And it may not necessarily always be academically related. It could be to aging population within that base area. Students aging out. I mean, that we see that in the Briar Creek area where families moved in, and the average age, we're not seeing new children being born into some of these schools. So I mean, it gets very, it gets a little complicated when we're talking about vouchers, from a funding perspective. Does that kind of answer your question, Brad? It was sort of layered.
Well, I guess my basic question is, if you think there could be, I mean, the pot of money doesn't change. You've got a X amount of dollars allocated to education. The question is how it gets divided up among different schools. And what I'm suggesting or asking, I guess, basically, is if some of those funds at least were dependent on parents and students picking the school, wouldn't that potentially provide a mechanism for improving the quality of the overall set of school choices that folks have by dint of rewarding the schools that are doing a good job and giving ones that weren't doing as well at satisfying their population an incentive to improve?
And I hear that, but I think if we're saying schools that are doing as well, are we talking about test scores? Are we talking about standardized test scores? Are we talking about surveying parent satisfaction at the school?
Well, that would be theoretically redundant, because your basic feedback mechanism is whether people are going to that school or not, whether they like it, whether it's doing a good job, or in their opinions, in the parents and the students' opinions. Sure.
And there is so much individual opinions, and some year you have a teacher that your child doesn't really mesh with, but that's certainly not reflective of the whole school, or from every teacher. So it gets complicated, but in terms of schools being desirable and wanting families to go there, that is something that every school should constantly be monitoring it. And our schools in Wake County and across the state, they do sort of a panoramic survey at the end of every year where they get very detailed questions about things like parents are, how are you satisfied? What hinders you from volunteering if you aren't volunteering? So there are these extensive questions, and schools and principals are tasked with really making good use of that information and then taking approaches to either implement that into their school improvement plan, which is also a required document that by legislation that our schools are required to do. So, I mean, some of those things are sort of taking place already, perhaps not, you know, out in the open. But, you know, I think what you're describing, I mean, from a philosophical standpoint, I think that, yes, you know, that's just going to be, again, one of those things where it's complex it sounds simplistic, but there are so many layers when you peel it back that complicate that. In an ideal world, I think, yes, you know, that would be great. But it's, you know, but there just are so many layers and so many different types of students and so many different types of needs that make it a little challenging. But I do I hear what you're saying.
Well, thank you. I'm going to try to get in, if you have the patience, Heather, 3 more questions. We have Sean is on deck, and then we followed up by JD. Sean, go ahead, please, and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, Heather, and hi, Libertarian Party. I appreciate y'all and think y'all really add some value to the local political discourse here. So thanks for having me and Heather here. Heather, I just appreciated a lot what you said a few minutes ago. I think you might have referred to it as your reason or an important moment in your education process as an educator. You mentioned a student who you know, didn't participate much, and I think this is your language. Correct me if I'm wrong, but was sort of being passed up through the system, maybe, and missing some interventions along the way. You noted that the student would be the first to graduate from high school, I think. So thinking about students like that, I was wondering, what interventions are there in Wake County for students like that, students who may not be doing their work or meeting age-appropriate academic standards, but they continue to be promoted year after year? How does the school system identify and intervene with those students?
I appreciate that question, Sean. You know, that is something where when we're looking at guidance counselors, this also greatly varies depending on the grade level. So what that is going to look like, particularly for younger students versus older students. I think our elementary schools have a lot of targeted ways that they provide intervention. A lot of that is actually statute-based with Read to Achieve and so forth. So there are a lot of sort of things schools have to do. And unfortunately, I think you're right. I think that's a problem, especially when we're looking more at middle school and high school age students that may, you know, just sort of get they're moved along. But guidance counselors at schools are supposed to, you know, there are different reference points, different factors, risk factors that they look at in terms of monitoring students' grades, the number of absences. And so they're, you know, should be monitoring those things. And then depending on what risk factors are there, suggesting, you know, helping with either academic interventions, working with literacy coaches or math coaches, working with the family in terms of absences, you know, getting the child into school. So that does vary greatly from school to school, but that's usually the social worker and guidance counselor, depending on the grade level of the child. So those are some of the more basic intervention strategies that are used sort of across the district.
Thank you. I have a question from JD. Has not asked a question yet today or this evening. JD, your turn.
Hi, thank you for coming and speaking to us. I hate to keep bringing this back to vouchers, but I do feel like Wake County has done a really great job in offering a lot of school choice through magnet schools, through charter schools, through other programs to allow students to have their choice. But I know when you were answering that last question about, about funding and how vouchers might affect the funding for the public schools. Right now, at least North Carolina average is a little over $10,000 per student in funding. My son is attending a private school and the tuition is about half of what the state spends per pupil. And I was just wondering if the county or, if vouchers were allowed in a lesser amount than what the county is currently spending per pupil, wouldn't that increase the per pupil funds available to the county? Just as a practical matter?
I don't think that's how that would work. So you're saying if vouchers were offered for, say, $5,000, you're saying that would increase?
Wouldn't that increase the money available to spend per pupil in the traditional public schools? Because I know that the traditional public schools, they get their per pupil funding, plus they also get expenses for maintenance of the facilities and things like that, that's separate from their per pupil funding. But wouldn't that pot of money, if say each county gets a block of money for the number of children that are in that county, and if they start using some of that money as right now, what they're doing is they're allocating that money. I'm not exactly sure how they're deciding how to spend that money per pupil, but if students were to get a voucher, then you're taking somebody out of that school system. They're getting less than what the county would have spent per pupil in order to send them to a school of their choice. And then the remainder of that money can then be divided amongst the remaining pupils.
Okay, and I understand what you're saying now. I think, unfortunately, the number of students it would take and the number of remaining students it would take for that to work to outweigh the number and amount of fixed cost in operating a school, it would make it very, very challenging to try to balance that out or even increase it. Because there are so many fixed costs involved in operating schools that are not necessarily to do with the number of students attending the school. So if we have an under-enrolled school, there's still going to be fixed costs to operate that building. And it's so that's sort of, I think, what you were getting at.
Okay. Thank you, Heather. So you agreed to about 45 minutes. We're at 50 minutes, and I appreciate that. I haven't asked the question. I think everybody else who had at least one question has gotten one turn. I'm going to kind of bring it home real quick. Sean kind of touched on it. I was a stepfather to a kid who spent 5 years in the Harnett County Public School System because Beowulf was apparently tremendously important to learn and master before getting a high school diploma, especially for somebody who didn't learn consumer math very well or have opportunities for vocational training. But I'm going to kind of come at this question a little differently. You mentioned Plan A, Plan B, Plan C, how some charters are less accountable. How much would you rather answer to that inbox you talked about when you started the call? Meaning, if it was, how much more power do you wish Wake County Public Schools truly had? In the sense that, if there wasn't a Plan A, B, and C that came down from the state, if it was just Wake County Public School Board would determine when teachers go back to the classroom, what those plans would look like, I feel sometimes, and I got the sense with a lot of the questions tonight, it's like, all these other opportunities are better. Why don't you allow all these other opportunities? And the question is sometimes not asked, well, what if we just took some of the rules, restrictions, regulations off the public school system and let the public schools be more accountable to parents locally? Like, I feel like sometimes you guys are almost set up to not do well. And I sort of saw that in Harnett County in my own family. So just if you would kind of touch on how much more independence you wish you had or did not have.
I do appreciate that, David. I think with the reopening plans, it's impossible. There's no good plan B. Operating schools in a hybrid would only work if you suddenly had the funding and an available pool of highly qualified educators to teach, to have all these, have additional teachers come into schools. And the truth is we don't have the funding for that, and they're not out there, particularly in certain subjects, special education, math. I mean, there's not this highly qualified pool of educators. Teacher education programs have reduced enrollment every year and have, I think, since the Great Recession. I'm not sure the start time from that, but it is very, it's very difficult. And yes, plans like that do make it feel like you're being set up to fail. Some of the read to achieve bits of legislation, it's like the intention is so good. At least I want to believe that it's there in good faith, but it's so hard to implement some of these programs. Like the way the curriculum and the standards work are, if you have an instructional assistant in every classroom, but we don't have the funding, and we have 8,000 fewer instructional assistants across the state of North Carolina. So I do wish that the local school districts had a little bit more flexibility with a lot of different things, and particularly like the class size mandate. I don't know how many of you hear about that, and like lower class sizes for elementary kids. Heck yeah, that sounds like a great thing, but it's kindergarten, and I'm going to get the numbers wrong, I think is 18 students per class. First grade is 16 students per class. Second grade is 17 students per class. I mean, why is that? So when you think of a principal trying to, assign classrooms and assign teachers to students, it becomes so challenging. So that's a really thing. That's just one small example. So yes, I wish there were more opportunity. But at the same time, if you speak particularly to Republican legislators, though, they'll tell you, well, you might be okay, but this school district out here, they need all of these rules and regulations. So, it is definitely a hard balance to find. But the accountability measures, at the same time, they do need to be there. People do need to know, we need to know where our students are at, and parents deserve to know, how their students are doing as well.
Okay. Well, thank you for your answer, and thank you for bringing up class sizes. That and calendars always come to mind.
Yes.
Where are you on patience? You're a parent of two. I have, looks like 2 more questions, but I also know that you do this quite a bit. Do you need to wrap? I mean, your commitment to us was 45 minutes, and I appreciate
I've
that.
got a little bit of time. It sounds like I know my kids are in 3rd and 5th grade, but we still do bedtime stories as a family every night. But I heard my husband and the dog handling that in the other room. So I've actually I'm okay for a few more minutes.
Okay. We have 2 more, what I hope are short questions coming. Dee, if you would, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
So one of the things you mentioned is that some of the schools are surveying parents at the end of the school year. But I noticed in Wake County, every year, the number of students leaving the school increases, even as a percentage. There's literally thousands of families who have left. And has anybody thought to surveying the people who left? Because like when I was completely disgusted with a school, I left the system. I wasn't around for the survey at the end of the year. Nobody's surveying all the thousands of Lake County residents who are still taxpayers who have left the system for reasons.
And that actually is something that I think during COVID has been just a challenge, but that's something that, that I specifically asked, and I know other board members have as well. I also asked that our Office of Student Assignment do sort of an exit survey, and also if students, families who maybe applied to magnet schools, and if they didn't get in, did they end up not coming to the Wake County Public School System, and why? So we do have those sort of exit surveys to capture that information. That's absolutely important information to know for a number of reasons. So again, that's been put on pause, but that is something that has been, that was supposed to have and had been taking place at least in the 2019-2020 school year. But again, when COVID hit, it's, everybody's been just overwhelmed.
Well, thank you. And our final question of the evening will be from Terry. Terry, if you would please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Heather, I'm a second grade teacher in a charter school. I've taught in private school, public school, and charter schools. And I'm finding that I have more parent participation in the school that I'm in, 100% participation from my parents. I've never had parents volunteer. Even through the COVID, they're sending things in. My kids have the supplies they need. I just have to ask for something and a parent will provide it. And I'm also finding, we found out too, that teaching in a charter school, we get about 2,000 less per student than public school. And I don't know why that is. I have 23 students, 15 in class and 8 online. I work as hard as anybody else, and our students we get less per student than the public school. So I'm just saying that by parent surveys, parents are pleased to bring their school. They have that choice of bringing their kids there, and we have very few students leave. In fact, our school has grown, and we have like 400 more students coming in next year. And it keeps on going up because parents have that choice to bring their kids to a school where their children are getting a good education.
Do you have bus service for every child?
No, there's no bus service. Every parent brings we have over 1,000 students, and everyone is carpooled.
Do you have a cafeteria, a full service cafeteria?
Yes.
And in terms of special education students, do you have self-contained classrooms where you might have students with severe disabilities feeding tube?
Yes, I have one kid. I have 2. I have one that's has visually impaired, and I have a VI teacher that comes in, and a TA that helps with that particular child, just that one child. And we have a great MTSS system. I feel that all my students, it's very diverse. I have 4 groups where I have low, medium, low, and high and medium high, and all of them are getting what what their needs are, and parents are very pleased that the children are getting the help that they need.
And I think you would highlight, that when you do have parents who are able, for whatever reason, to be involved, more involved in their child's life, I mean, that is a huge.
It definitely is.
That's very important. And, we know, I don't know how many McKinney-Vento students you have in the Wake County Public School System. On any average year, we do have about 4,000 students who are experiencing homelessness, and they are bused. I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with that, so their transportation is used to bring those students to their school before they lost their stable housing. You know, and I'm sure that you understand that, you know, that there are so many, we have got a large population here in Wake County,
Right.
and it is a diverse population, and that there are families who experience things that, you know, all of us sitting here right now certainly have varying levels of, you know, comfort and stability, but we're all here. We all have internet access. We're all sitting in our homes. We all have some sort of electronic device. And that's sort of like you know, coming to the table here from the very start. And so when your parent, or you have parent involvement, or two parents, or, you know, people who carpool, I mean, that often indicates that somebody has the flexibility within their day to bring those students to school. Somebody has the flexibility and the time to pick them up and to do that every single day. And there are just so many teachers, or parents rather, that don't have that ability. And then then further, it's a hardship for them to volunteer. I know at the charter school that I taught at, parents would come into the classroom to do lunch duty so the teachers could go and eat and have, you know, time away. The charter school was at a temporary location before they had their own building, and the students would eat in their classroom. And at that charter school, they did not have a cafeteria. So every child also was bringing a lunch. And while, excuse me, I know the school probably would have certainly provided for those children if they needed a lunch, none of them did though. And so, you know, when we're looking at different student populations, it becomes challenging. I'm not sure if any of you have ever viewed the documentary Resilience. This talks about adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. And if you're familiar with those, it talks about just sort of the impact that a stressful childhood, you know, for whatever sort of inputs, has a negative impact on kids. And part of the documentary shows a child that was assumed to have ADHD because they were hyperactive in class. And so they were given, you know, Ritalin. But for a child who's, you know, is that the right fix? If they have ADHD, yes. But if it's anxiety, no. You know, for those of us who have anxiety, which I do, I know when I get on my third cup of coffee, you know, that was a bad choice. But to, you know, this child, when they switched the medication that the child was on and for something that was more anxiety related, and also started alongside that cognitive behavioral therapy to help the child process what the trauma. I mean, one of their best friends had been shot the year before. I mean, just really horrible things. It was like night and day. And so when you think of having one or two kids like that in your classroom, you know, that's okay. Like, I'll fully admit that one boy, my first year teaching, I mean, he was really the only student that I had to go out of my way to provide extra interventions. But when you have this classroom where maybe 10 of your 15 students sort of fall into that category, I mean, that's so hard to do. You need a lot of supports in place to reach those children. And you know, it's very, very hard. And then on top of that, let's say you do have the very well-meaning parent who wants their child to stay in that school and they really want it to work out, but then they're like, oh, but I feel like my kid's not getting attention because the teacher's paying attention to these 10 kids. Well, those 10 kids need that attention, and so does that kid. But we can sort of see where this is every day in so many classrooms in the Wake County public school system. Particularly when you look online, if you go to this website, School Digger, D-I-G-G-R, it will show you demographics. It's the easiest way to find out demographics on any school actually in the United States. And when you see that Title I number, when you see the number of students who are economically disadvantaged going up, I mean, imagine all of those students and whatever chronic stress, because poverty is a chronic stress that those students are experiencing. It's very hard for teachers. High poverty schools tend to have a lot of teacher turnover. you know, it's just, I can't remember, David, I think you said, are they set up, you know, where we're setting up things to fail, and it's becomes this snowball, and it's very challenging to pull out of that.
Well, I'm finding too, because we're in person, they are doing so much better. The ones that came from, we were virtual the first 9 weeks, and then we went in person from there. And they are thriving, doing so much better being in person. The ones I have online are doing well, but I know it's not the best. It's not the best for them. How many schools in Wake County are in person, or any of them?
Every single school in Wake County is offering in-person learning right now. So grades 4 through 12 are currently in that rotating cohort where we've got kids in person, and then they're out. Grades K through 3 regional special education programs are all in person every day for those who chose that option. There are still virtual academy students who chose, whose families chose that for them, but every school is. And I'll agree with you. I've been walking through some of our schools in District 1. And for the kiddos who need it, it is just it's a game changer being there in person. I mean, even though it's different, but it is a game changer. And then on the other hand, I mean, there are some kids who this virtual thing is great for them. If they have ADHD and the smells and the sounds and the distractions were hard for them, I mean, they're actually doing better than they have been. So that's an interesting thing. But we also know that you know, we understand that in person is absolutely what some students need. You know,
well, we go every day, and it's working. You know, just like we're in school. They're troopers. They're wearing their masks. They social distance. They're running around kicking that soccer ball with that mask on. I mean, and no one's complaining. I mean, they're real troopers. I'm real proud of them.
All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead, and this has been a full hour. Heather, I can't thank you enough for joining us this evening. I guess Brian wants to say thank you as well. I hope I see a hand up, but this has been over an hour. So I do want to thank you for coming and speaking to us. Brian, did you have like a thank you wanted to share, or unmute yourself real quick?
No, that's just clapping my hand.
Oh, okay.
That's a
It was
hand clap.
Fantastic. All right.
You see, that's a hand clap.
There you go. Oh, I wasn't looking. I thought that was a raised hand. I apologize. Heather, again, thank you for joining us. If this wasn't going on, you would have actually gotten a beer and a free meal out of this. You would have joined us in person at Tobacco Road. It's usually one of the attractions for our speakers. But again, hopefully you can get in on some reading time. I want to be respectful and let you get on with your evening. But thank you again for joining us.
Well, I really appreciate it. And David, I appreciate everything. Brad, thank you for extending the invitation. You know, and it's clear, I say there's 24 chat comments and I've not read them all because I too have ADD. So I try to keep my focus as much as I can. You probably notice my speaking kind of goes from pond to pond to pond, but hopefully you could follow along with me. But thank you very much for having me. And I do want to say that, you know, I understand that there are people who say government schools and, you know, there's this, that there's a movement that doesn't support them, and that's okay. You know, people can have what they have. I wish you knew, and I wish that you saw the things that I see, because if you did, if you saw the efforts, if you saw the passion that I see within the schools that I was elected to represent at the board table, you would know why I am so passionate to keep those up, to keep them running, and to support them and to give them the resources that they need, because we're talking about children and we're talking about people who love those kiddos. And I hope that you know, everyone can take a moment and come to the table in good faith, so we can, as I think it was Brian who said, you know, how do we bridge these? How do we build bridges so that we can best serve every child? And that's what I'm all about. So thanks very much for having me.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you,
everyone. Thank you very much, Heather. Really appreciate it.
Ending the meeting now. Thank you.
Good night from NBC News.
Thank you, Heather.
Bye.
Thank you.